Everyone on Willow Street had an opinion about the two men who lived 4 houses apart. Craig drove a leased BMW that got swapped for a newer model every 3 years, wore visibly expensive watches, and hosted lavish backyard parties every summer that the whole block talked about for weeks afterward. Neighbors described him, admiringly, as clearly doing very well for himself. Roland, down the street, drove a 14-year-old Honda Accord with a dent in the rear bumper he'd never bothered fixing, wore the same handful of plain t-shirts most weekends, and hadn't hosted so much as a barbecue in years. Neighbors described him, sometimes with a note of pity, as someone who was probably struggling, maybe behind on the mortgage, definitely not doing as well as Craig. When Roland passed away unexpectedly at 67, his estate was valued at $3.4 million. Craig, meanwhile, filed for bankruptcy 2 years later, after a business downturn made it impossible to keep servicing the debt, quietly financing the lifestyle the entire street had spent over a decade admiring. This isn't a rare or unusual story. It's a pattern researchers studying actual millionaire households have documented so consistently that it's become one of the most well-established findings in personal finance research. The visible markers people instinctively use to judge someone's wealth, the car in the driveway, the clothes, the vacations posted online, correlate poorly with actual net worth, and in a meaningful number of cases, correlate in the opposite direction entirely. Multiple studies on self-made millionaires have found that the large majority live in middle-class or modest neighborhoods, drive vehicles several years old, and rarely spend conspicuously on the categories most people associate with being wealthy. The mechanism behind this disconnect comes down to a basic accounting confusion that almost everyone makes instinctively, without realizing they're making it. Mistaking someone's income statement, what they're spending and displaying right now, for their balance sheet, what they actually own free and clear after subtracting what they owe. Craig's BMW lease, his watches, and his parties were entirely visible and entirely real, but almost none of it reflected his actual net worth. The lease payment came out of monthly cash flow, financed in part by revolving credit card balances he quietly carried for years. The watches had been purchased through a buy now pay later service. The parties were charged to a card he didn't fully pay off most months. Every visible marker of Craig's apparent success was, in an accounting sense, evidence of spending, not evidence of wealth, and the two are frequently unrelated or even inversely related once actual debt is factored in. Roland's outward modesty told an equally misleading story in the opposite direction, though nobody on the street bothered to look closely enough to notice. His 14-year-old Accord was fully paid off and had been for over a decade. His unglamorous wardrobe reflected genuine indifference to status, signaling rather than financial hardship. And the money he wasn't spending on leases, watches, and parties had been flowing, consistently and invisibly, into a diversified investment portfolio for over 30 years, compounding quietly in an account nobody on Willow Street ever thought to ask about, because nothing about Roland's visible life gave anyone a reason to suspect it existed. None of this means every person driving an older car is secretly wealthy, or that everyone with a new car and nice clothes is drowning in debt. Plenty of people drive modest cars simply because they can't afford newer ones and aren't quietly building a 7-figure portfolio in the background. Plenty of people with visibly nice possessions have paid for them entirely in cash from genuinely high, sustainable incomes, with no debt involved at all. The mistake isn't assuming visible spending sometimes reflects real wealth. It's assuming visible spending reliably indicates wealth at all, when the actual data on how self-made millionaires live suggests the opposite pattern is, if anything, slightly more common. The quieter, more modest-looking household is more often the one with the larger balance sheet, precisely because avoiding visible status spending is one of the more consistent behavioral traits researchers find among people who've actually accumulated significant wealth. This disconnect exists because visible spending and wealth accumulation are, for most households, in direct competition with each other for the same limited pool of income. Every dollar Craig directed toward a leased BMW and a rotating watch collection was a dollar that wasn't available to invest. Every dollar Roland didn't spend on status markers was a dollar that had the opportunity to compound for 3 decades instead. Over a long enough timeline, the household prioritizing visible spending and the household prioritizing invisible accumulation tend to diverge dramatically, even when they started with comparable incomes, precisely because the two priorities are quietly pulling from the exact same source the entire time. There's a reason this pattern persists across generations despite being fairly well documented at this point. Status spending provides an immediate, tangible social reward, admiring glances, compliments on a new car, a reputation on the block as someone who's clearly doing well, while invisible accumulation provides no social reward at all until decades later, if ever, and only then to whoever happens to see the eventual estate value or account statement. Humans are, generally, far more responsive to immediate, visible rewards than to delayed, invisible ones, which is precisely why the behavior that actually builds wealth, quiet, unglamorous, unremarked upon saving requires a kind of psychological discipline that spending on visible status symbols simply doesn't. The people who avoid Craig's outcome and end up closer to Roland's generally aren't unusually gifted investors or unusually high earners. They're people who've made peace with the fact that building real wealth and appearing wealthy to neighbors are frequently at odds with each other, and who've chosen, consistently, the version that nobody on the street will ever compliment them for, understanding that the version people do compliment is, disproportionately often, financed by debt rather than reflecting genuine financial security. Willow Street eventually found out about both men's actual financial situations. Craig's through the very public bankruptcy filing, Roland's through the equally public reading of his estate 2 years earlier. Neighbors who'd spent over a decade quietly judging Roland's dented accord and pitying what they assumed was his financial struggle were left, afterward, with a considerably more uncomfortable realization that the entire time they'd been forming opinions about who on the street was thriving and who wasn't, they'd been reading exactly the wrong signals, for exactly the reason almost everyone reads them wrong. People naturally notice what is visible. But real wealth is often built in places nobody sees. The millionaire next door may not look like a millionaire at all. The strongest financial decisions are often the ones nobody notices, because true wealth is not what people see you spending. It is what you still own after everything you owe is removed.